Hello everyone, welcome to Soulday Thursday number 3. Today we're looking at Aristotle's Poetics, which is the origins of literary criticism. It's great to see everyone here in the room, and great also anyone who has joined the live stream. Thank you for giving up your time to hear what I have to say and what everyone here has to say. In terms of who we've got in the room, we've got Charlie Gavin, who's my oldest friend. I've known him since I was 4 years old, and he makes guitars, amongst other things. There's Simon Grossabel, historian, who I met from university. We've known each other for 15 years. There's Banksy, he's an architect who lives in the same village as my parents and now in London. Then there's Kate, who works in publishing. She's recently published a book on Freud, Lucian Freud. And then Margaret, who is an accountant and works at Four Corners, which is the gallery from which we rent this space. And she's an ally, and it's great to have her here. And finally, Patricia, who has just joined Sentio Space yesterday and is a photographer and has come with all sorts of ideas that I've been hearing and actioning as much as we can over the course of 48 hours. Moving on to the talk. To recap for where we've got to so far, we're looking here at a story that has moved right the way from 1300 BC with the Trojan War until the current day. So about 600 years after the war, Homer writes his Iliad. And the Iliad is based on the Trojan War, which is believed to be a true event. Then he writes a sequel, the Odyssey. And whilst the Iliad is a 10-year battle to try and take Troy by the Greeks, and ultimately they're victorious, the Odyssey is a 10-year return home. And you can see on the map, we've got Troy, and then we've got Ithaca there, and that's the journey that Odysseus has to take from Troy to Ithaca. Fast forward another 300 years, and Aristotle writes his Poetics, and he's based in Greece. He's part of a rich philosophical culture that includes Socrates and Plato and many others. And it's worth noting that at the moment, all of the main currents of Western thought and imagination are coming from this particular part of the world. Move forward a bit further, and Virgil writes his Aeneid, and Virgil was a Roman. So at this point, the empire, the shift of power, has moved towards Rome, towards Italy, and Virgil writes in Latin, whereas everything so far has been written in Greek. Dante then writes his Divine Comedy. The Romans have had hegemony for a long period, and Dante signals the turn of or at least the beginning of the Renaissance, and partly that was because he chose to write in Tuscan, his local dialect. And having done that, many other writers chose to do the same thing. And in the Divine Comedy, the key character takes Virgil's Aeneid with him down into the underworld. And in Virgil's Aeneid, the character Aeneas, who's the protagonist, is one of the characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we've got the same story passing through over 1,000 years. Then we've got Paradise Lost, Milton, and this was a similar structure and story, but rather than being a battle about the gods and about waging war between the Trojans and the Greeks, this was more a war between good and evil. It was a more of a Christian story. And then right up to the current day, we've got James Joyce's Ulysses, and Ulysses is the Greek translation, or is it even the Latin translation of Odysseus. And here we've seen the power shift towards the UK that happened with the British Empire. So that is, it's a snapshot. It's not the story, but it's a key sketch of the way that the Western imagination has changed over time. And we've managed to get up to Aristotle's Poetics. So as mentioned, there was a rich culture in Athens at the time of Aristotle. Socrates was Plato's teacher. Socrates famously never wrote anything down. Everything we know about Socrates, we know from what Plato wrote. Plato then taught Aristotle, and Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. And the reason why it's really important that Aristotle taught Alexander the Great is that Alexander the Great was a great conqueror, and he proliferated Greek philosophy and values, namely the Greek philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Here we can see the route that was taken by Alexander the Great over the course of his reign. It was pretty epic. And he had under his bed, or under his pillow, whatever they had at that time, famously, a copy of Homer's Iliad. And he was particularly inspired by a character called Achilles, who showed no mercy, showed no pity. He was the greatest man. He's the greatest Greek. And that energy, that lack of pity, helped Alexander to be deadly in his pursuit of power. And apparently, when he eventually got to the border of India, he wept because there was nothing else to conquer. And after his reign, we then had the Holy Roman Empire, which brought about Christianity and immersed itself in many of the values that Greek society had embodied. And then after that, we've got the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And it's quite a simple yet complex current that has moved from then until today. And if we want to understand the viewpoints that we hold, the ideas that grip us, then an appreciation of these stories that we're going through will help achieve that mission. Here you can see Troy. Alexander stopped at Troy on a little pilgrimage, just as a nod to Homer and as a nod to Achilles on his way through, and that would end up being the source of the Roman Empire, which became its capital. So they changed its name. It was Byzantium and then Constantinople, and that held until 1453, when the Ottomans then became the rulers, and it changed its well, actually didn't change its name until the Ottomans lost their rule in 1922. And it changed to Istanbul in 1923. So anyway, that's a basic sketch of the area. Moving now on to Socrates. Although the subject of this talk is Aristotle, it doesn't seem fair to talk about him without mentioning Socrates, who was his master's teacher. And Socrates had this quite simple story that he told about the relationship between art, reality, and the ideal. So he says the most perfect table is God's table. After that, we've got the carpenter's table that the carpenter makes as a copy of God's table. And then finally, we've got the painter's table. The painter paints the carpenter's table that is an imitation of the perfect table. So there's the order of perfection that was espoused by Socrates. Plato then picks up this mantle and he turns it into his theory of the forms. Forms is a bit of a weird phrase, but what he's getting at is this perfect form, this godly form. And for him, that was the perfect, and it exists beyond reality, and it was the ultimate form. And then after that, we have life that aspires to the forms, but it always falls short. So it's not as perfect as the perfect moon. And then finally, we've got art that aspires to life and again falls short. And when you see this going from left to right, you can appreciate why Plato renegated artists and poets to beneath carpenters, because he felt like they were producing shadows of shadows, painting shadows of shadows. Then when Aristotle arrives, he flips it on his head. It would have been really controversial at the time because Socrates held more or less the same view, and Plato, and then Aristotle, who's been taught by Plato for 20 years, goes, I'm not too sure that this perfect form that you talk about, this perfect moon, is where we should start if we're trying to understand the true, the good, and the beautiful. I think we should start with the real moon. So he says, let's start with life. That is the source of knowledge, not this thing that, as far as Aristotle is concerned, doesn't exist without reality. It's not transcendental. Art then imitates life, and the forms do exist, but they're found in life and in art. So he flipped it on its head, and we're going to see soon why this is relevant to Aristotle's Poetics, but it's important to understand. And I gave this talk recently to everyone at Sentio Space, and they said, I think you're spending too much time on the forms. Maybe you should drop that section and only focus on Aristotle's Poetics. So instead I added in this extra slide. which I hope will help people to grasp it. Not that one can grasp it. I don't fully understand what Plato is getting at with the forms. Neither does Aristotle or Socrates. It's a theory. But it's there. And here we've got Plato's perfect apples. And you can see there's four of them. And as far as Plato is concerned, all other apples are aspiring to these perfect apples. And from that, you can deduce a mathematical world. So 1 plus 1 equals 2. And this mathematical world is very related to the forms because it's unchanging, it's internal. And the question arises, does mathematics, i.e. do the forms, exist independent of the reality that we know? And Aristotle goes, well, no, they don't. Because these perfect apples that you're looking at, these 4 apples and these numbers, don't exist in reality. In reality, we have 4 apples, all of which are different. And from those 4 apples that are different, we can deduce the 1 plus 1 equals 2. And we can deduce a concept of a perfect apple. But none of them exist without this imperfect world that is life. And then if we look at how this relates to understanding what is true and good and beautiful, these apples at the bottom are all particular types of apple. They're not general, whereas all the ones at the top are the same, like mathematics. And Plato, with his theory, he goes, we start with the general, we move to the particular, we start with the forms, and from that we get our theory and our practice. Whereas Aristotle goes, no, we start with particular, we start with life, and then through that we get to our general theory. Here's a painting that Raphael painted at the School of Athens. And I've zoomed into the center point. In the Renaissance paintings, they always put the subject in the center. And you can see here Aristotle is pointing up to the sky. Plato is pointing up to the sky, and Aristotle is pointing to the ground. And it's Raphael making that point that Aristotle, they're obviously friends, but Aristotle is saying, look, we get what we know through this ground that we can see and touch and feel. And Plato's going, no, we get it through these stars, these godly forms that live beyond us. And that was what divided them. But they do both believe in goodness, beauty, and truth. It's just how they get there. And for Plato, theories first, which is a priori. And for Aristotle, practices first, which is post priori. And it's just as a side note, you would imagine that someone who puts theory first would be a bit dry, because theory is instinctively dry. But Plato writes with much more poetry than Aristotle does, who's incredibly dry. The Poetics that we're going to get onto is tedious. It's hard work, although it is also fascinating. And maybe it's because they were both longing towards what it is that they didn't have. They revered that which they lacked. So here's a line that I think gets across, again, this view that Aristotle holds. The things we have to learn before doing. So learn is the theory, doing is the practice. The things we have to learn before doing, we learn by doing. So the things we have to learn by doing, we get the theory from the practice, i.e. we get our theory from practice. Truth is post priori. And this relates to Aristotle's Poetics because he decides to focus it mainly on a book that already exists. So he's taking it from the practice. And how do the forms relate to art? And here I've picked out a painting by Francis Bacon, studied for Portrait 1, 1956. And to me, this reveals all of these ideas in one. Firstly, you've got the forms in life. So you've got these lines, these abstract lines that are quite mathematical, that are boxing him in. There's a psychological element. Is he feeling boxed in? But there's a sense also to this drawing into the fundamentals of the architecture. So it's revealing the forms, but it's also revealing the life in the forms because it's simultaneously able to show the mathematical, eternal aspect of the structure, whilst also showing the human being in the center of the picture. It's not aspiring to be the forms. It's not following what Plato's saying. It's not, this art is clearly not trying to be this perfect ideal that doesn't exist outside of life. It's also not aspiring to be life. It's not an exact replica of a man sitting in a chair. There's been something else that's added to it. It's aspiring to be art. What does it mean to aspire to be art? That's a hard question to answer for another day. But I do think it's best answered by art, not by any other means. Now on to Oedipus Rex. So I spent a long time talking about how Aristotle favors getting his theory from practice, and he writes his Poetics based on Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, which he believes to be the best tragedy ever written. So in order to get to that book, we need to do a quick sketch of Oedipus Rex. which we're going to go to now. So firstly, an oracle predicts that Oedipus will kill his father and sleep with his mother. And the oracle predicts this to Oedipus's parents. They're obviously pretty concerned. So they send him away at birth to avoid that fate. I think it's not a problem. As long as he's not here, it's impossible for him to kill his father and have sex with his mother. Later, Oedipus, he grows up, he doesn't know that he's adopted, and he hears the same fate. They go, Oedipus, you're going to kill your dad, and you're going to have sex with your mother. And Oedipus goes, oh, God, I really don't want to do that. So Oedipus leaves home, but he doesn't realize that he's adopted. He doesn't realize that by leaving home, he's not leaving his mum and dad, and he actually ends up on his journey, killing his father without knowing it's his father, arrives at a new place, and ends up marrying his mother, who no longer has a father because the father's been killed by Oedipus, unbeknownst to her, on his journey to see her. So she doesn't know it's her son. He doesn't know that it's his mother. Later on, there's this huge plague, although this is, in fact, how the story begins. There's a huge plague, and Oedipus wants to be the king who has solved the plague. He's answered the question of COVID. And he's told that in order to solve the question, they need to know who has killed the original king, as in who's killed his father. So obviously, he brings the soothsayer out, and the soothsayer says, look, you really don't want to know the truth because it's going to harm you. He goes, no, I do want to know the truth because I'm going to be the one that solves this issue of COVID, or this issue of the plague. He finds the truth, and when he discovers what he's done, he decides to gouge out his eyes. His mother, on discovering the truth, hangs herself. And ultimately, the prophecy is realized. It's a brutal, brutal story, but it still rings true today. When I read it, it did strike me with its power, even though it was written 2,000 years ago. And there's many messages that can be gleaned from it. Probably the one that shines forth the most is that we're not in control of our fate, however much we try to avoid a potentiality it's going to happen anyway. There's another point to be made around, do we want to know the truth? Now, Oedipus was insistent that the soothsayer tell him what's going on. And the soothsayer said, look, you really don't know the truth. And he's like, yeah, I do. But once he found out, he then blinded out his eyes. And then the final one I'd say is, or there are others, is that even though he could see, he didn't see the truth. And then once he'd got rid of his eye, once he'd seen the truth, he then became blind. So lots to draw out of it. Thou wast born fated to misery. There's a summary of Oedipus Rex. And here's a little clip that was made by Jenny Wright, who's a London based animator. Charming style, where she uses these crayons on paper. This is lined paper. And here she's showing Oedipus moving from a state of being able to see to not being able to see. So here are the key points of Aristotle's Poetics. First of all, art imitates action. So to him, action, all human happiness or misery takes the form of action. And he writes out this framework for what makes a good story. And he says that a good play must incorporate the following in order of appearance. Firstly, plot. The Greek word is mythos. And nowadays, when we hear the word myth, we assume it's something that's not true. But to the Greeks, mythos was something that revealed a truth, a universal truth. So that's the core, that's the action. And then after that, we've got the character. So who is doing the speaking? In the case of Oedipus, it's Oedipus, someone who we do like. We know he's fundamentally a good guy, but he's flawed and he makes mistakes. But Aristotle points out that a tragedy can go without character, but it must have action. You know, some might say that John Terry doesn't have a character, but when he misses the penalty in the Champions League final, it was a tragedy. Although John Terry does also have character, I would say. But the point still stands. So thought is what is said. So these are the ideas that are carried through the plot. For instance, this idea, thou wast fated. Now that is that's some of the thought that it's expressed. Then it's how it's said. That's the language. That's the eloquence. Then the melody, which today, because bear in mind this was a play, and it was performed on stage, and you'd have music. So you put music next, which nowadays is the soundtrack, and then finally it's the spectacle. So he put special effects as the least important thing. Nowadays, we often put it as the most important thing. And I'm not sure whether it should be last or not. Most of the talks and lectures I've watched online agree that it should be placed at the bottom, but I do wonder whether the part of the reason why he puts the spectacle at the bottom is because when the plays were made back then, the most exciting spectacle you could have was like two guys dressed as a horse, whereas nowadays we can do quite a bit more. So what makes a tragedy? Again, this is him coming up with a theory of what is a tragedy based on practice. Oedipus's Rex. He thinks it needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. So within one circle of the sun, he famously says, that which is added or removed makes no difference, is no real part of the whole. This is a great line, and it ends up getting picked up by later critics of storytelling and poetry in general, where they say that a good poem is one where you can't remove any word and it still be as good as it was without that word. And similarly, you wouldn't want to add one. And he's recognizing that it's being refined. He also has these two phrases, peripeteia, change in fortune. So this is the idea that someone needs to go from being in a good state to a bad state. And so we have in modern stories, we have Star Wars, where Luke thinks that he's killing Darth Vader, and then he actually realizes that he's killing his father. So his fortunes shift in that change. And at the same time, there needs to be a discovery process from ignorance to knowledge. So for Oedipus, he goes from not knowing what he's done to knowing what he's done. Complex, not simple. He thought they should be complex to be good. A good person passes from happiness to misery. It's really important that it's not a bad person. If you want to enjoy the play, if someone bad goes from good to bad, it's not that emotional. But when it's someone you actually like, it hurts. And it was also to him important that it's a star. You know, Oedipus was the king. He wasn't an ordinary man. And this wasn't about making it exclusive poetry that could only be enjoyed by some. It was about pointing out the fact that even those who are kings are fallible and can be brought to the ground. So it was by aspiring to the universal that was chosen. And then he has this word 𝐓𝐀𝐋𝐊, which is error. Nowadays you sometimes hear people say tragic flaw, but it's that mistake that people make, and you forgive them for it, but they rarely do they forgive themselves for it, because they know it's on them. And with Oedipus, it was his like burning desire to know the truth and to be the one that solves the issue of the plague. But if he hadn't been so curious and so sort of greedy for the truth and to be the star, then he wouldn't have understood that knowledge, and he wouldn't have had the decline. We've also got fear and pity, which he mentions quite a bit. And fear to me, when you're reading the book or watching the play, it's that feeling that something's going to go terribly wrong for this character that you quite like, and you quite like them because you think that if I were in a similar situation, I might end up making the same mistakes. And then the pity comes about because it's someone you care about. That's linked to the good person passing from happiness to misery. And Aristotle felt that the purpose of this whole tragedy, so there you can see the form of the tragedy coming through the practice of the Sophocles Oedipus Rex. So he says the audience's pity and fear are purged during the fall. There's an act of catharsis. We say now it was cathartic when we do something. What does Aristotle mean? And the interpretation I find most persuasive, or at least the most interesting, is that we all have pity, we all feel pity, and we all get scared every now and then. But is it something that we should have? Is it good to be scared all the time? And is it good to have pity? Is that going to lead to the best situation? And to Aristotle, the question was no, we should be ruthless. And by watching a play like this, that emotion is purged, and then we can act in a way that is without pity and without fear. And that's probably what he taught Alexander the Great, who then goes round going, well, I shouldn't show any pity to those whom I'm conquering. I should just run through them and do it for the sake of culture. He would have had ideology behind him. And the final thing is that the story comes about through necessity, not probability. When you hear it, you don't think, oh, it was really likely that that was going to happen. And you have this in life where you're telling a story. You go, it was too good to be true. You couldn't make it up. It came out of necessity rather probability. And that's the role that fate is playing in the story. There's Aristotle's Poetics. This is the final slide. Why does Aristotle prefer tragedy to the epic? The tragedy is shorter. Oedipus Rex is a tragedy. The epic is much longer. It contains many chapters. The Iliad, the Odyssey, Paradise Lost, they're all epics. Why does he prefer it? He comes up with these 3 reasons. Well, other reasons, but these are 3 that I've picked out. All parts of the epic included in tragedy, but not all of tragedy in the epic. There's less unity in a larger piece, and the more concentrated effect is more pleasurable. And I saw these 3 lines and I thought, well, it's easy to counter the reasoning on all 3 counts. And I won't go to every single one, but less unity in a larger piece only applies in the particular instances. There are larger pieces that have less unity than smaller pieces, and vice versa. There are smaller pieces that have more unity than larger pieces. And you can do the same with all 3. And I think what Aristotle was sensing is the universal significance of Oedipus Rex, which is incredibly profound. And there's great lines. Time alone shows man's honesty, but in one day you may discern his guilt. And this here has the same structure as what most modern science is based on, the idea that you can see an infinite number of black swans and you still don't know all swans are black. You only need to see one white swan to know that they're not. And that's why we often prove the hypothesis to be false. And you've got that same theory contained in one line in Sophocles Oedipus Rex. And on top of that, you've got this idea of hubris and fall, which is very much like Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, they both wanted the knowledge from the tree of knowledge. And then once they've got it, they're then condemned to toil the land and they cover themselves and they have a fall. It's the same structure as Oedipus Rex, and it was written after Oedipus Rex. And I'm convinced that whoever wrote Genesis would have read this story. So I think he preferred a particular story. And from that, he made a general inference that the category, the tragedy, is better than the epic, which is going counter, I would say, to what he's generally trying to say, which is that we should get our truth through the particular, and the particular should be primary. So I think he was led astray by his heart, the heart. This is actually the last slide. So Sophocles has a line where he goes, towers and ships and nothingness void of our fellow men to inhabit them. I love this line because I was thinking when I read it about how during lockdown there were pubs and stadiums that were empty. And the towers and ships, I would say, are more general. They're closer to the forms. They're closer to mathematics. You can imagine a tower looking like another tower. But our fellow men, fellow women, they're more particular. All men and women are so different. You can't really imagine a rubric that applies from one to another. So here we've got the more general and the more particular, and clearly the particular here is being placed above the general. So i.e. the general is nothing without the particular, and universal truths are found in art.